There are three unique people who have taken the role of Jesus, and this role changed their lives. The role of Jesus has a special way of changing people. Number 1. Jim Caviezel. Jim Caviezel was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood at the start of the 2000s. He starred in hit movies that typically grossed over $90 million, like The Thin Red Line and The Count of Monte Cristo. But all of a sudden, that disappeared. How is that even possible? Although it seemed like he was on track for a long and successful career, something changed after he took on one unforgettable role. And many of us know the role. It was the role of Jesus Christ in Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Can you imagine? You want to know what's crazy? Mel Gibson warned him. When Jim was offered the role of Jesus Christ in The Passion of the Christ, it wasn't a decision to be taken lightly. Mel Gibson, the director of the film, knew this better than anyone. Before Jim accepted, Gibson pulled him aside for a serious conversation. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. He told Jim, "If you take this role, you'll never work in this town again." This wasn't a casual warning. Gibson was fully aware of the controversy surrounding the film, even before it was released. He knew that playing such a significant and polarizing figure could put Jim in the crosshairs of Hollywood criticism and public scrutiny. Many actors might have hesitated or even backed out after hearing something like that. But Jim's response was immediate and unwavering. He later recalled his words to Gibson, saying, "We all have to embrace our crosses." For Jim, this wasn't just a career decision, it was a calling. He believed deeply in the message of the story and felt that this role wasn't something he could turn down, no matter the cost. Taking on the role of Jesus wasn't just about acting for Jim. It was about faith, conviction, and a willingness to sacrifice his reputation in Hollywood for something greater. He once said, "We have to give up our names, our reputations, our lives to speak the truth." These words capture the heart of his decision. Mel Gibson's prediction wasn't far off. After The Passion of the Christ was released, the film became a cultural phenomenon, but also a lightning rod for controversy. For Jim, the consequences of his choice were almost immediate. Hollywood turned its back on him, and many filmmakers who once saw him as a rising star now viewed him as too risky to cast. But Jim didn't regret his decision. Instead, he leaned on his faith, fully embracing the role and its impact on his life. After Passion of the Christ hit theaters in 2004, it became one of the most talked about films in the world. It shattered expectations, grossing over $600 million worldwide on a modest budget, and was praised by many for its raw and faithful retelling of the final hours of Jesus' life. But for Jim, who delivered a powerful and deeply emotional performance, the story wasn't as simple as critical acclaim or box office numbers. The film didn't just divide audiences, it divided Hollywood. While many fans celebrated his portrayal of Christ, the industry's reaction wasn't as warm. Hollywood has long been known for its complex relationship with faith-based films, especially ones as direct and unflinching as The Passion. Some in the industry labeled the film too controversial, too polarizing, and by association, Jim became a controversial figure as well. One thing was clear: Jim wasn't seen the same way in Hollywood anymore. Before The Passion, he had been a rising star with roles in big productions. After The Passion, the calls from major studios slowed down, and he found himself on the outside, looking in. Jim later reflected on this, saying he didn't mind the change. He was willing to sacrifice his career to be part of the story. In his own words, "Jesus is as controversial now as he's ever been. Not much has changed in 2,000 years." He understood that playing Christ meant he might never play another big Hollywood role, but to him, it was worth it. However, if you think Jim is a great Christian, I promise you that you will not expect what he did next in Hollywood. He single-handedly faced one of Hollywood's standards. In Hollywood, romance sells. Love scenes are often a key ingredient in making films appeal to a wide audience. But for Jim, drawing boundaries around on-screen intimacy wasn't just a professional choice, it was a deeply personal one, rooted in his faith. Jim made it clear early in his career that he wouldn't participate in explicit love scenes. He told the New York Post in 2002, "I have a hard time getting naked on film. I don't believe in it. I don't think it's right. In my faith, I'm taught that abstinence is important." One of the most notable examples of this was during the filming of Angel Eyes, a romantic drama where Jim starred alongside Jennifer Lopez. From the start, Jim had certain conditions for the love scene. He said, "Put a top on her. I'm going to keep my shorts on. She's going to keep hers on." This wasn't about being difficult. It was about respect. Jim explained that this decision was out of devotion to his wife. He wanted to honor their relationship and stay true to his beliefs, even in an industry where such boundaries are rare. Similarly, during the filming of The Count of Monte Cristo, Jim took his co-star Dagmara Dominček aside to talk about his boundary. She later recalled him saying, "I'm married and very faithful." Her response? "Jim, it's a Disney movie." While they joked about it, Jim's commitment to his values was clear. Jim's conservative approach to on-screen intimacy set him apart in Hollywood, but it also made it harder for him to land certain roles. In an industry where chemistry and physical connection between characters are often seen as crucial, his unwillingness to cross certain lines could be seen as a limitation. But for Jim, these boundaries weren't about fitting into Hollywood's mold. While his choices may have limited the roles he was offered, they also earned him respect from those who shared his values. Jim showed that it's possible to work in Hollywood without compromising your beliefs, even if it means taking the road less traveled. Fame. It's something many people dream of. The applause, the recognition, the feeling of being adored by millions. But what happens when the applause fades? What happens when your name isn't in the headlines anymore? Jim has seen the fleeting nature of fame firsthand. He often talks about the emptiness of worldly recognition and contrasts it with something far greater, God's eternal Hall of Fame. He shared this thought-provoking message. "This crowd on earth, they will soon forget when you're not at the top. They will cheer like mad until you fall, and then their praise will stop. Not God. He never does forget. And in His Hall of Fame, by just believing in His Son, forever there's your name." Here's another part of Jim's message that really drives this home. "I wouldn't trade my name, however small, that's written there beyond the stars in that celestial hall, for all the famous names on earth or the glory that they share. I'd rather be an unknown here and have my name up there." In a world that often measures success by applause and trophies, Jim's message is a powerful reminder to look beyond the temporary and focus on the eternal. After all, what good is it to gain the world but lose your soul? Jim doesn't just talk about Jesus, he talks about Him boldly, without fear of what the world thinks. He reminds us that faith in Christ isn't meant to be hidden or watered down. It's meant to shine, even when it costs us everything. Jim quoted, "The Bible is alive right now. We're all playing different characters. I got to play Jesus. Some of us are playing Judas. Many of us are politicians. You see, there's good and there's evil, but most people, they're on the fence." Jim's words cut straight to the heart. He warns us about the danger of staying neutral. He says, there's a fight for that middle ground, the people who haven't yet chosen a side. Will they stand with Jesus, or will they drift away? He challenges us to ask ourselves, are we willing to stand for Christ, no matter what it costs us? Or will we choose comfort and avoid the fight? Jim doesn't just speak about Jesus. He lives for him, even in the face of rejection. Jim quoted, "I saw what John the Baptist did. I think about him all the time in this situation. Would you lose your head for Christ? Would you? I would, because I love him." These words aren't just for Jim, they're for all of us. Would we stand firm, even if it cost us everything? Would we declare our love for Jesus in a world that mocks him? Jim's answer is clear. He says, I love him, and I would give my life for him. Jim reminds us that standing with Jesus isn't always easy. He knows what it's like to be mocked and misunderstood. He's faced ridicule for his faith, and yet he stands firm, saying, I don't care what people think. My faith in Jesus is worth it all. Jim said, the Bible says, be holy, be perfect, just as my Father in heaven is perfect. That's not just a suggestion. That's the call for every believer. To be holy, to be set apart, to stand for Christ, even when it costs us. Jim's boldness is a call to action for all of us. He's not just asking, do you believe? He's asking, will you act on that belief? Will you stand with Jesus, no matter the cost? In today's world, speaking openly about faith can be like walking into a storm. And Jim knows this all too well. He's faced criticism, mockery, and outright rejection for being vocal about his love for Jesus. People have called him names, questioned his mental health, and tried to dismiss him entirely. But how does Jim respond? He doesn't retaliate or lash out. Instead, he smiles and says this, I just love Jesus. I'll give him whatever I've got. It's not my career, it's God's career. People can call me crazy, but I don't care. I love him. Jim's reaction shows us something powerful. True faith isn't shaken by what others say. It's rooted in love. Love for Jesus, the one who faced ridicule and rejection long before us. Jim often reminds us that Jesus was mocked, spit on, and nailed to a cross. If our Savior endured this for us, how can we let a few harsh words silence our faith? And Jim doesn't stop there. He challenges us to reflect on our own lives. Are we willing to stand firm in our faith when the world turns against us? Are we willing to be called crazy for Jesus? Around the world, Christians are persecuted every day. Jim's words remind us that our faith should be bold, unshaken, and public, even when it's hard. He says, I'm not ashamed of Jesus. I never will be. It's easy to stay silent, isn't it? To avoid criticism, to blend in. But Jim's example shows us that silence isn't an option. Faith isn't just a private belief, it's a public declaration. And when we choose to declare it, yes, the world may mock us. But remember this, Jesus said, Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. We live in a world that feels more divided and chaotic than ever. People argue over politics, beliefs, and lifestyles. It's easy to feel like something bigger is going on, something we can't fully see. Jim points out exactly what that is, a spiritual battle that has been raging since the beginning of time. In one of his interviews, Jim explains what the devil's role is in this battle. He says, What does the devil mean? It means divider. Satan accuses us, pointing out our sins, but God never gives up on us. He sent his Son to save us. Jim explains how the devil works to tear us apart. He divides families, communities, and even our own hearts. He whispers lies, convincing us that we're not good enough or that God doesn't care. But that's where Jim's message hits home. God is always fighting for us, even when we can't see it. Jim reminds us that we're not fighting against people, but against spiritual forces that want to pull us away from God. He says, every time we sin, we deny Him. And every time we choose selfishness, pride, or fear, we give the enemy a foothold. The battle Jim talks about isn't just happening somewhere far away. It's happening right here, in our homes, schools, and hearts. He points out that many people are stuck on the fence, afraid to take a stand. He warns that this middle ground won't last forever. And for those who think they're not in the battle, Jim has another wake-up call. He says, "The fight is over that middle third. I'm going to take as many of these middle third with me as I can." Jim sees this fight as a chance to bring people back to God. He's not just talking about pastors or missionaries, he's talking about you and me. We're all called to be part of this spiritual army, to stand up for our faith, and to bring others along with us. But here's the beautiful part of Jim's warning. We're not fighting alone. God is with us every step of the way. He's given us His Word, His Spirit, and His promise that we don't have to be afraid. The question is, will we take up the fight? Or will we let the enemy win by staying silent, passive, and afraid? Jim's challenge is clear. Stand firm, love boldly, and trust that God is greater than anything we face in this world. This isn't just Jim's battle, it's ours, and the time to choose is now. Jim's story about how God called him is simple, yet incredibly powerful. It all started in a movie theater. At a moment when he felt lost, God spoke to his heart. Jim says it was a moment he will never forget. Here's how Jim described it. God came to me in a movie theater. I felt like I was His only child. I never knew how much He loved me until that moment. Then He said, "I'd like you to be an actor." I didn't believe in myself, but I believed in Him. And if God believes in me, then I can do anything. Think about that for a moment. Here was a young man, unsure of his purpose, crying out to God for direction. And when God gave him an answer, he didn't hesitate. He didn't let self-doubt stop him. Instead, he leaned into the faith that God had a plan for his life. Jim took that leap of faith, and it led him to play one of the most challenging roles in film history, Jesus Christ. It wasn't easy. He faced criticism, physical suffering, and even moments of fear. But through it all, he trusted in God's purpose for his life. Jim once shared how he felt during one of the most grueling scenes in The Passion. "I was so cold. I was shaking. My shoulder was dislocated and I could barely stand. But I remembered that this wasn't about me. It was about Jesus. It was about telling His story. And in that moment, I prayed, 'God, give me the strength to keep going.' And He did." Jim's story reminds us that trusting God doesn't mean life will be easy. It means that even when things are hard, we have a strength that comes from beyond ourselves. When we lean on God, we can do things we never thought possible. He says, "I don't believe in myself. I believe in God. And if He gives me a task, then I do it." Jim's trust in God is an example for all of us. He reminds us that when God calls us to do something, our job isn't to figure it all out. It's to say yes, because God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Think about your own life. Is there something God is calling you to do? Maybe it feels too big, too scary, or too impossible. But remember Jim's words, if God believes in me, then I can do anything. And if God believes in you, what's stopping you from stepping out in faith? Jim's message ends with a profound reminder. The applause of this world is temporary, but the approval of God is eternal. Think about it. On earth, people chase fame, wealth, and recognition. They want their names in bright lights, in history books, or on trophies. But what happens when the applause stops? When the lights fade and the crowd moves on to someone else? Jim says it so beautifully. Your name may not appear down here in this world's Hall of Fame. In fact, you may be so unknown that no one knows your name. But don't forget, God has rewards He'll hand out someday. In God's Hall of Fame, your name can be written forever, not for how many followers you had or how many awards you won, but for one simple act, believing in His Son, Jesus. That's all it takes to secure your name in eternity, not just for a season or a generation, but forever. And here's the amazing part. You don't have to be rich, powerful, or famous to have your name written in heaven. God doesn't care about your resume or your achievements. He looks at your heart. Are you willing to trust Him? Are you willing to believe in Jesus and follow Him? This crowd on earth, they will soon forget when you're not at the top. They will cheer like mad until you fall, and then their praise will stop. Not God. He never does forget. And in His Hall of Fame, by just believing in His Son, forever, there's your name. Imagine this. Your name, however small or unknown here on earth, is written in heaven. It's written beyond the stars, in a place where no one can erase it. It's written by the hand of God Himself. That's the kind of fame that matters, the kind that lasts for eternity. Jim's words remind us to shift our focus from temporary things to eternal ones. The world may mock you. They may say you're crazy, just like they said about Jim, but God sees you. So, what will you choose? Will you chase after the praise of men? Or will you pursue the approval of God? Jim chose the latter, and he's urging us to do the same. I wouldn't trade my name, however small, that's written there beyond the stars in that celestial hall, for all the famous names on earth or the glory that they share. I'd rather be unknown here and have my name up there. This is the promise God offers to each of us. Your name can be written in His book, sealed for eternity. All you have to do is believe in His Son and follow Him. Fame on earth will pass away, but your place in God's Hall of Fame will never fade. That's the reward that matters most. Let's not trade eternal treasures for temporary applause. Choose Jesus, stand firm in your faith, and know that your name is written where it truly counts. Jesus of Nazareth, 1977, the actor reveals bombshell. This might be the most recognized man who played the role of Jesus, and his name is Robert Powell. Although many people are familiar with The Chosen, there was an actor whose role, the role of Jesus, has stood for a generation. Portraying Jesus in the life of Jesus wasn't just a role, it was life-changing. But it wasn't easy. Starving for authenticity, enduring physical pain, and wrestling with spiritual questions, it became a turning point in his life. Before this role, Powell was known for playing sharp, sophisticated characters on British television. He had charisma, wit, and an undeniable charm. But this project would demand far more than acting chops. The transformation wasn't just physical. Over the 9 months of filming in the deserts of Tunisia and Morocco, Powell didn't just portray Jesus. He began to experience the depth of the character's mission, struggles, and teachings. Powell later admitted, "Before this, I had no particular interest in religion and no opinion of Christ, but playing him changed me." This isn't just a story about an actor and a role. It's about the journey of a man who discovered faith in the process. Before this role, Powell's knowledge of Jesus was limited to Sunday school stories, basic and incomplete. "I knew that wasn't enough," he admitted later. Determined to prepare himself, Powell read the Bible in its entirety, not just as a book, but as a deep study. Powell dove into historical accounts and theological writings, analyzing the character of Jesus like never before. He wanted to understand Jesus as both a man and the Son of God, someone who defied the political and social norms of his time. An actor has to be objective when interpreting a part, Powell explained, but after months of studying Christ's life and teachings, it would be impossible not to believe in him. The filming location itself added to the authenticity. It was part of the challenge, pushing Powell and the cast to fully inhabit their roles. But as Powell immersed himself in the role, the line between acting and believing began to blur. He wasn't just learning about Jesus, he was beginning to feel his message. This was only the beginning of a journey that would shape Powell in ways he never imagined. As Robert Powell continued his journey to portray Jesus, he began to feel the weight of the role pressing down on him, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. This wasn't just another acting challenge, it was becoming a deeply personal experience. Jesus isn't a cozy man. He never does anything by degrees, and he expects the same from his followers. Playing him, an actor, would realize the enormity of what he stood for: total commitment, total sacrifice. "I had to understand Jesus as a man," Powell later reflected. "His divinity is undeniable, but he also lived, struggled, and suffered as we do. That duality was key to portraying him authentically." As the production moved forward, Powell's journey was only just beginning. The beauty and challenge of the Sermon on the Mount was a glimpse of what lay ahead, a heavy burden that would test him in ways he never expected. The Sermon on the Mount was one of the most iconic scenes in the life of Jesus. It wasn't just a pivotal moment in the story, it became a deeply personal experience for Robert Powell. Surrounded by hundreds of extras, with the morning sun rising over the olive groves, Powell felt a wave of emotion unlike anything he had ever experienced on set. It was beautiful, absolutely stunning. Halfway through the scene, he was so affected by it that I began to cry. It wasn't planned, it just happened. The beauty of the moment overwhelmed him. As Powell spoke the words of Christ, the weight of their meaning seemed to settle on him. Powell later described the Sermon on the Mount as one of the most moving experiences of his career. The words are so simple, yet so profound, he reflected. They carry a beauty and truth that speaks to everyone. But the emotional high of the scene also left Powell drained. This was more than a role. It was becoming a journey of faith and self-discovery. After months of filming, the production reached its most grueling scenes, the crucifixion. For Robert Powell, this was the ultimate test. Every detail of the scene was designed to reflect the agony of Christ's final hours, and Powell was determined to embody that suffering authentically. The physical demands of the scene were immense. The cross Powell carried wasn't a prop. It was solid wood, intentionally heavy to simulate the weight Jesus would have borne. Powell later admitted that the weight of the cross wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It gave him a sense of the incredible burden Christ must have carried, he said. But the challenges didn't stop there. The most dangerous moment came during the first take. As Powell was hoisted onto the vertical bar, the ropes holding the cross began to slip. In that split second, his life was at risk. The scene was filmed against a gray, stormy sky to capture the somber mood of the crucifixion. Despite the physical pain and the freezing conditions, Powell pushed through, driven by a deep sense of responsibility to the role. Theoretically, it wasn't supposed to be difficult, but the combination of exhaustion, hunger, and the sheer weight of the cross made it one of the hardest things I've ever done. It wasn't just acting, it was an ordeal. For Powell, the crucifixion scene was more than just a performance. It was a moment of profound connection to the story of Christ, a story of sacrifice, pain, and redemption. He later described it as a turning point, both in the film and in his own journey of faith. But the cost of this commitment was high. Powell emerged from the scene physically battered and emotionally drained. Yet he also felt a sense of purpose, one that would stay with him long after filming ended. As the filming progressed, Robert Powell began to feel a profound internal shift. The role of Jesus was no longer just a job or a performance. It had become deeply personal. Immersed in the life and words of Christ, Powell found himself grappling with questions of faith, meaning, and purpose. Living this story, it is impossible not to be affected by it, Powell admitted. The words of Christ, once abstract and distant, became alive for him. He found himself moved by their simplicity and power, particularly the call to love, forgiveness, and sacrifice. For Powell, the Sermon on the Mount was especially transformative. Delivering those lines, he said, felt like stepping into the mind and heart of Jesus. He spoke with such authority, but also with such love. It's hard not to believe in someone like that, Powell reflected. The role also changed Powell's perspective on humanity. Surrounded by people from different cultures and backgrounds, he saw firsthand the universal power of Jesus' message. Whether or not they shared his faith, everyone on set seemed drawn to the story's themes of hope and redemption. As Powell continued to explore the character of Jesus, he began to see the world and himself differently. He admitted to becoming more humble, more introspective, and more aware of his own shortcomings. The role was changing him, shaping him in ways he hadn't expected. "I think I'm a different person now," Powell said. "Playing Jesus has made me think deeply about what it means to live with purpose and compassion." The internal shift Powell experienced wasn't just about faith. It was about finding a new sense of direction and meaning in his life. Through the role of Jesus, he began to see the world not just as an actor, but as someone deeply connected to the story of humanity. "I was working 11 hours a day, barely eaten. The combination of nerves, fatigue, and the intensity of the role made it one of the most taxing experiences of my life." The relentless schedule and harsh conditions of filming in North Africa took a toll on Powell's body. The scorching heat, cold nights, and sandstorms added to the challenges. Yet, Powell refused to let the discomfort affect his performance. "Sometimes I was so focused on the role that I didn't even notice the injuries," Powell admitted. On one occasion, he walked into a metal grating, cutting himself badly. Another time, the incense used in a scene left his lungs burning. But he brushed it all off, determined to stay in character. Despite the challenges, Powell found moments of reflection. He often wrote in his journal, capturing his thoughts about the role, the lessons he was learning, and the ways it was changing him. These quiet moments helped him process the enormity of what he was experiencing. As the production neared its conclusion, Robert Powell found himself reflecting on the immense significance of the story he had been living for months. The life of Jesus wasn't just a script to him anymore. It had become a lens through which he viewed the world. Powell was struck by the simplicity and power of Jesus' message. "What amazes me," he said, "is that 2,000 years after his death, so few people actually live by his teachings. Love, forgiveness, and humility. They're universal, yet they're still ignored in so many parts of the world." Powell couldn't help but draw parallels between the world of Jesus' time and the modern era. Religious divisions, political unrest, and the struggle for justice were as present in the 20th century as they were in ancient Judea. "He shall not, I hope, have died in vain," Powell said with quiet determination. "I think I'm a much humbler person now," he admitted. "Jesus was the ultimate example of sacrifice and selflessness. Portraying him has made me more aware of my own flaws and the ways I can improve." Powell found himself drawn to the teachings of Christ, not just as a historical figure, but as a source of wisdom and inspiration. The role had opened his eyes to the deeper truths of life, truths that he carried with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. For Powell, the story of Jesus wasn't just about the past. It was a call to action for the present and the future. Through his performance, he hoped to inspire others to live with more compassion and understanding, just as Jesus had taught. As the final scenes wrapped and the cameras stopped rolling, Robert Powell was left with more than just memories of a challenging role. The experience had transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But beyond the personal change, Powell began to wonder, could his portrayal of Jesus inspire others to see the world differently? Returning to normal life after portraying such a monumental figure was no easy task. Powell found himself reflecting on the ways the role had shaped him, not just as an actor, but as a person. There's a certain weight that comes with playing Jesus. It's not something you leave behind easily, but I think that's a good thing. It reminds me to live with more intention, to think about how my actions affect others. For Powell, the role had been a journey of self-discovery. He had started as an actor with little connection to faith, but he emerged with a newfound respect for the life and teachings of Jesus. He couldn't deny the profound impact the experience had on his worldview. The role also left Powell with a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices Jesus made. He was more than just a figure of history, Powell reflected. He was a man who gave everything for his mission. That kind of devotion is rare and humbling to think about. The life of Jesus received critical acclaim, with Powell's performance hailed as one of the most powerful portrayals of Christ ever captured on screen. But for Powell, the greatest success wasn't the accolades. It was the hope that the film might inspire people to live with more kindness and understanding. If this film brings even one person closer to understanding the message of Christ, Powell said, then it's all been worth it. Robert Powell's journey wasn't just about playing a role. It was about stepping into a story that has shaped humanity for centuries. Through the challenges, the pain, and the profound moments of connection, Powell emerged changed, a man who had come to see the world through the lens of compassion, humility, and faith. Narrator. And so the question remains, how will you let the story of Christ change you? We also created a movie about the complete life of Jesus. To watch that video, click here. The moment that made Jonathan Roumie depressed on set playing Jesus in The Chosen. When it comes to actors that have carried the role of Jesus, I have noticed that most people have the most deep emotional connection to that of Jonathan Roumie. This might be one of the most recognized men who played the role of Jesus, and his name is Jonathan Roumie. However, for this actor, there was a single moment that made him depressed on set. And it was so powerful that only 10% of you might guess it correctly. But what if I told you? This moment nearly broke him. What if, for a brief moment, he doubted everything, even his ability to continue? What was this moment? And why did it push him to his emotional and spiritual limit? For professional actors, unexpectedly breaking down on a movie set is uncommon. This happens when the actor feels a deep emotional connection to the character they are playing. Most people would think that it would be the scene of the cross, which would be understandable, but it wasn't. It was something far more unexpected, a scene that felt so real. It left Jonathan questioning if he could even finish filming. Imagine stepping into the shoes of the most beloved and powerful figure in history. The pressure, the expectations, the weight of getting it right. Jonathan Roumie may have given us one of the greatest portrayals of Jesus ever, but behind the scenes, it cost him more than anyone realized. What happens when the role you play starts playing you? What if the emotional weight becomes so heavy you can't put it down? What moment pushed him over the edge? And more importantly, did he ever recover? What scene left him feeling completely crushed? And how did he find the strength to keep going? Stay with me, because this story is going to shake you. Before The Chosen, Jonathan was at his lowest point. In an interview with The Wrap, he revealed, "I was broke. I was out of food. I was desperate. I had no options. All I could do was surrender my circumstances, my career, my life, my finances, everything over to God. 3 months later, I booked The Chosen. My life has never been the same since." It was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, but little did he know that breakthrough would come with a massive burden. Fast forward to The Chosen Season 5. This was the season where everything changed, not just in the story, but for Jonathan himself. This wasn't just acting anymore. It was something deeper, more dangerous. This season was different. It wasn't just another chapter in the journey. This was the moment everything was leading up to. The betrayal, the Last Supper, the agony in Gethsemane. Which of these moments finally pushed Jonathan Roumie to his breaking point? Imagine knowing you have to film one of the most heartbreaking betrayals in human history. Now, imagine feeling that betrayal as if it were real. What if, for a moment, he wasn't Jonathan anymore, but Jesus? Imagine standing face to face with the person playing Judas, someone you've built a connection with. Knowing this moment will change everything. Jonathan felt that. He lived that, and it wrecked him. And for a moment, he wasn't sure if he could come back from it. And in that moment, something shifted inside him, something he wasn't prepared for. Jonathan knew this season was going to be intense, but what he didn't expect was how deeply it would affect him personally. In a recent interview, Jonathan admitted, "I just felt completely out of my element for that scene. I was saying these words that Jesus said, and all of a sudden I looked at these people, my fellow actors playing the disciples, and I had this moment of, what am I doing here? And in that moment, something shifted inside him. Something he wasn't prepared for. What was happening inside his mind? And why did this scene affect him so deeply? But it wasn't just confusion. What did he realize in that moment that made him feel like he was breaking inside? It was overwhelming sadness. How did the cast and crew react to seeing Jonathan completely shut down? He later revealed, "I was just depressed for most of the time we were filming. But was it just depression, or was something else at work?" He then said, "I think people on set didn't know how to react to me. I was shut down. I was carrying this unbearable weight, and I think it showed." Why? Because this wasn't just a scene to him. This was history. This was real. He confessed that this season had been the most emotionally draining experience of his career. After that moment, something changed. Jonathan shut down. For days, he barely spoke to anyone. And when he did, his words carried a weight that no one could quite understand. He wasn't joking around on set. He wasn't decompressing after scenes. He was sitting in silence, alone with his thoughts. And the most heartbreaking part? No one knew how to approach him. The crew could see the weight he was carrying, but no one could lift it for him. But what if no one dared to? What if they felt something was deeply wrong? He later admitted, "I was depressed for most of the time we were filming. It was devastating. I don't think I was ready for the level of empathy I felt for Judas and for Jesus." And this wasn't just emotional, it became physical too. Many people would have found Jesus' choice of the 12 odd. He didn't scour the temple for the brightest and best scholars. He ignored the multitudes of Pharisees who devoted their entire lives to obtaining God's favor. Judas was the only selection that would have made sense to onlookers in his day. This fine, strong-hearted zealot from Kerioth of Judea. Judas received the same training, the same benefit of being in close proximity to the Son of God, and even the same authority to heal the sick and condemn Satan's agents who had taken control of certain men and women. He eventually won enough trust to hold and manage the group's treasury. Jesus also knew that had a betrayer on his team. Why did Jesus choose Judas, knowing he would betray him? The betrayal is described in even more chilling terms in the Gospel of Luke. What happened the moment Satan entered Judas? And what does it mean for his soul? Then entered Satan into Judas, surnamed Iscariot. Luke 22. Satan enters a person's life. He leads them in sinister directions. This scene first took place during the Passover. Jonathan Roumie, playing Jesus, made a very shocking statement. "For the Son of Man goes to the cross, just as it is written in Scripture of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." Can you imagine God saying that to you? Christ ate the Passover with his friends the night before he died. The joys and comforts of that ritual helped him get ready for his upcoming sorrows. When it was evening, he came with the 12 disciples. While they were reclining at the table, Jesus said, "I assure you, and most solemnly say to you, that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be grieved and deeply distressed, and to say to him one by one, "Surely not I." And he replied, "It is one of the 12 disciples, one who is dipping bread in the bowl with me." It is safe to say that this was one of the most startling things that the disciples had ever heard from Jesus. But they had heard many other surprising things from him. How did the other disciples react when Jesus announced the betrayal? And why were they in denial? Every single one of them did not have any suspicions about Judas. And the notion that one of them would try to betray and kill Jesus must have seemed ridiculous to them. Jesus did not point out Judas, though Judas, sitting in the place of honor, would have been given the special portion. All the disciples dipped with him, so this phrase identified the betrayer as a friend. In the culture of the Middle East, betraying a friend after eating a meal with him was and is regarded as the most heinous form of treachery. Jonathan wasn't just emotionally drained. His body was shutting down too. But was it just exhaustion or something far more chilling? What physical symptoms did he experience while filming? And were they spiritual attacks? During the first day of filming The Last Supper, he felt a sharp pain in his ear. So intense, he thought something was seriously wrong. And then, it got worse. Much worse. What happened moments later that convinced Jonathan something supernatural was happening? Then came the heart palpitations. Was it stress, anxiety, something else? He texted his spiritual director, desperate for help. And what happened next was nothing short of a miracle. His spiritual director replied, "I'm praying a rosary for you right now." 15 minutes later, the pain was gone. But here's what most people don't understand. Playing Jesus isn't just about acting. It's about stepping into the mind of the most powerful, loving, and misunderstood figure in history. And for Jonathan, who is already deeply religious, that meant something profound. But what if this wasn't just faith? What if it was something he never expected to experience? He later admitted, "None of us know what it's like to be divine. We do know what it's like to be human. So, the only thing I can do is bring the utmost of my humanity to the role and let the Holy Spirit handle the rest." But that's easier said than done, because every time he steps on set, one thought lingers in his mind. What would Jesus think of my portrayal of him? And what if, one day, he felt like he failed? In an emotional interview, Jonathan was asked, "If you could sit down and have a cup of coffee with Jesus, what would you ask him?" His response? A single question that broke everyone who heard it. His response? A single question. How did I do? That moment broke everyone. Because for Jonathan, this role isn't about fame, it's about honoring Jesus. So, how does he keep going? How does he push through the exhaustion, the weight, the overwhelming pressure? His answer is simple. Prayer. He revealed. Before every season, before every scene, before every take, I pray. I ask God to allow His voice to be heard through mine, and then I just let go. That's how he carries the weight. That's how he finds the strength to continue. Imagine playing Jesus, knowing your friend is going to hell. With good reason, Judas is considered to be one of the most notorious sinners in the history of the world. Nevertheless, if he was acting in accordance with a prophecy, could he really be evil? Yes, his own wicked motive condemned him. When it comes to the day of judgment, Judas will never be able to explain himself in front of God by stating, "I was fulfilling prophecy." Despite the fact that the death of Christ was foretold, it is still the hands of evil that were responsible for putting him on the cross and causing his death. The statement, "It would be better if Judas had not been born," emphasizes the tragic destiny awaiting Judas and the sorrow of Jesus over the betrayal by one of his own. Betraying Jesus, the Son of Man, is not just a personal betrayal, but a universal one. Judas betrays the very one who will judge the world. His fate was a terrible one. We see this judgment in the last minutes of his life. What happened in Judas's final moments that made his fate even more tragic? This scene is harder as we know what finally happened to the betrayer. Judas confesses that he sinned by betraying innocent blood. Why did Judas try to return the money? And why did it do nothing to ease his guilt? The enormity of his act of betrayal rests heavily on his conscience. Had he truly repented of his pattern of rebellion, he would have been impelled to seek forgiveness of his sin from God. Instead, he turns to the chief priests and the elders, who are just as guilty of Jesus' blood, and who respond, "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." Their hearts are even more hardened than Judas's. Judas tries to return the 30 pieces of silver he received when making arrangements for the betrayal, but he cannot relieve himself of the guilt of the sin, even though he throws the blood money into the temple. Then Judas went away and hanged himself. This is the only incident of such in the New Testament. Did Judas regret his betrayal? Or was something even darker at play? Rabbinic Judaism considered that act morally wrong, a rebellion against God, who gave life and who alone may choose to take it. The early church also regarded death as a kind of murder of oneself, and was therefore prohibited by the 6th commandment. Imagine playing Jesus, knowing your friend is going to hell. According to what Jesus taught, hell does not have a set amount of time, but rather exists forever. Those who are tormented in hell are doomed to an eternity of torment. Jesus was quoted as saying, "The fire never goes out." Jesus shared a similar sentiment for those that are headed to hell. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 hands and go into hell, into the unquenchable fire, where their worm does not die and the fire is not put out. If your foot causes you to stumble and sin, cut it off. That is, remove yourself from the source of temptation. It would be better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not put out. If your eye causes you to stumble and sin, throw it out. That is, remove yourself from the source of temptation. It would be better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where their worm that feeds on the dead does not die, and the fire is not put out. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good and useful, but if salt has lost its saltiness, purpose, how will you make it salty? Have salt within yourselves continually, and be at peace with one another. For Judas, to go to hell is to go into the fire that shall never be quenched. Hell is also called the lake of fire in Revelation 20, a place prepared for the devil and his angels. Matthew 25. Revelation 20:13-15, Amplified Bible. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades, the realm of the dead, surrendered the dead who were in them, and they were judged and sentenced. Jesus spoke of hell as outer darkness. He mentioned fire in relation to hell at least 20 times. Judas will then face Jesus again. At the end of time, everyone will stand before Jesus Christ, and he will separate humanity into sheep, those who display their faith in Jesus via their good actions, and goats, those who do not demonstrate their faith in Jesus through their good works, those who did not trust in Jesus Christ. Imagine playing this scene. Even though Jesus knows Judas is betraying him, he still calls him friend. This shows that Jesus is responding with calmness and not anger or hatred. He's acknowledging what Judas is there to do, but he's doing it in a way that still shows care for Judas. Jonathan Roumie's journey is far from over. Season 5 has been the most challenging and emotional season yet. But the story isn't finished. The Garden of Gethsemane, the crucifixion, the resurrection, it's all coming. And Jonathan? He's carrying that weight one scene at a time. Could he carry this role to the very end? Or had this moment already taken too much from him? And the real question is, will you be watching? However, there was another man that played Jesus, and there was one scene that broke him. To watch, The moment that made Robert Powell cry on set playing Jesus of Nazareth, 1977. Click here.